Okay, so our next table to be created in the school database is called the teacher details, which has the teacher's ID as the primary key, their first name, last name, birth date, hire date, state, remarks, and the creation date. So let's go to the SQL Server Management Studio. So I have already entered these details, entered these statements as follows. So just to remind that we are in the school database, if we select this statement and run the query, it will show the database in which you are working at this place. So it's very important to know the database in which you are working. So in order to create the table called teacher details, we just enter these details and set the teacher's ID as the primary key, which is an integer data type, and the first name, last name both are the varchar character of 30, and then hire date and birth date of data type called date time, state of 30 characters, which is a varchar again, remarks of 100 characters, which is a varchar, and the creation date as the date time data type. So now let's select this statement and then execute the command. So command is completed successfully. So if you want to check the table we created in the school database, we can look over here. So right now we can see just the student details that we created before, but if you want to look the new table called teacher details that we have just created, we can refresh this table. After refreshing, if we click this plus sign of the tables, then we can see the teacher details table has been created. Okay, so DBO means the database owner or the database schema. So this has been created. So our next table is called subjects, where it should have the subject's ID as the primary key, subject name, and then the teacher ID, and then the creation date. Okay, so here teacher ID must be used as a foreign key, I guess, but it is not specified here, maybe in the another task. So right now we are just going to create the table as it is specified in the description. So in order to create the table called subjects, we go to the SSMS again, and then we are using the database, school database, just to make sure that we are in the school database. And then we are going to create the table called subjects, and then we must have the subject's ID, which must be an integer and need to set as the primary key. Then we have the subject name. This can be longer than the 30 characters, maybe 50. Then we have teacher ID. So in order to have the same thing, in order to match up the ID, I need to check if I used as a teacher's ID or teacher ID. So I used a teacher's ID. In the description it's mentioned just teacher ID, so it's a mistake. So if we use teacher's ID, then we have to use teacher's ID here, and if we use teacher ID here, then we have to use teacher ID here. So I have already used it as the teacher's ID. I'm going to write as teacher's ID. Okay, teacher's ID. And then we have delete this all once. The next one is creation date again. You see, yes, date. So let's select this statement and then execute the command. So one command executed successfully. Here we haven't set the teacher's ID as the foreign key, but maybe in the next task we need to specify as the foreign key as well. But right now we are just asked to create the table and the database, school database, and then within the school database these 4 tables. So we are not asked to make it as the foreign key, so it is not mentioned here as fk. Okay, so maybe in next task we will be asked to make it as the foreign key. So let's have a look over our table that we have just created called subjects. Okay, let's just refresh the school database and then have a look. So the table called subject details has been created here, and if we check the GUI interface, then it mentions that it is specified, or it is set as the primary key. The subject's ID has been set as the primary key. Okay, and teacher's ID as well, but it is null. Okay, it hasn't been mentioned not null, so I have not set it as a not null key. And then the creation date time is date time data type as it is. So our next task is to create the table called classroom with classroom ID as a primary key, then subject ID, student ID, teacher's ID, creation date. Okay, so classroom classroom, then we have classroom ID, classroom ID, which is set as the primary key, and then put all of those things such as student ID, subject ID, student ID, again should be integer, then again subject ID. Wait, I need to check if it is subjects or subjects ID, so I need to write subjects ID, and then teacher's ID is as it is. So let me check the student or student's ID. Student ID. Okay, student is subject's ID, teacher's ID. Okay, and then the creation date. So let's run these commands and execute the query. What happened? What's the mistake here? Oh, I missed the data type here. Okay, so let's run this command again. Okay, commands completed successfully. So let's have a look over our tables in the database. Let's refresh the school database, and then let's have a look at the tables. So you can see here the classroom table has been created, and if we check the graphic user interface, the classroom ID has been set as the primary key, which is not null. Here